Welcome to Unholy Inquiry, where each tale leads you deeper into a labyrinth of mystery waiting to be uncovered. This time, join us as we delve into Miss Marple and the Clock Stopped Dead, a fan-crafted story that pays homage to the genius and sophistication of Agatha Christie's iconic detective, Miss Marple. We are thrilled to have you with us on this captivating journey. Share your thoughts, let us know where you're tuning in from, and if you spot any details we missed, your feedback is invaluable. Together, let's continue to shape even more thrilling enigmas. Chapter 1. The Bell at Dusk. A gentle evening in Little Witchford is broken by a single, chilling chime no one can explain. It was the sort of evening that made one think of warm crumpets by the fire and a small glass of sherry before supper. The sun had dipped low behind the copper beeches lining the road to Greystone Manor, casting long shadows across the village green. In Little Witchford, the hedgerows were just beginning to scent the air with late honeysuckle, and smoke curled from chimneys like grey ribbons against the pink-tinged sky. The calm was of the unspoken sort, felt more than heard, broken only by the gentle clatter of teacups in Miss Ellingham's parlour and the rustle of newspapers in the hands of retired Colonel Spence, who sat outside the tea shop, his pipe as ever unlit, but ceremonially held. It was precisely at 6 minutes that the bell tolled. Not the vicar's bell, it had not rung since evensong last Sunday, nor the school bell, long silent since the children had dispersed. No, this was a different sound altogether. One sharp chime, then silence, as if a clock, hidden somewhere in the bones of the village, had struck out of turn or in protest. Mrs. Harding dropped her knitting in surprise, and little Elsie Moffat, returning from the grocer's with a paper parcel of boiled sweets, stopped in her tracks and looked round uncertainly. Even the collie outside the hare and hound raised his ears as though hearing something none of the humans could quite place. At the edge of the village, past the footpath that wound like a ribbon through blackberry brambles, and up toward the rise, stood Greystone Manor, large, aloof, and ivy-clad, with 3 chimneys and a turret that looked as though it belonged to another century altogether. There, behind drawn curtains and shuttered windows, a drama had just reached its silent climax. It was the maid, Alice, who found him. She was not prone to nerves, being a stocky girl from Leeds, with a talent for starching collars to mathematical crispness. But the sight of Mr. Lancelot Grieve, head of the household, patron of the village fete, and benefactor of the Bell Restoration Fund, slumped in his leather armchair with his eyes wide open and quite dead, caused even Alice to drop the tray of post-supper brandy glasses and scream. The bell, as it turned out, had chimed from the study mantel clock. It had been broken for months. "Stopped at precisely 6 o'clock, you say?" said Inspector Cray, scratching behind his ear with a chewed pencil. He was a stout man with thinning hair and the rather beleaguered look of someone frequently called upon to interpret the doings of gentlefolk. "And no one touched it?" "No, sir," Alice replied, wringing her apron. "It was stuck for weeks. Mr. Grieve said he liked the silence." The inspector looked up from the clock face, frowning. Then why did it chime tonight? That, of course, was the question. The house was full that evening. Mr. Grieve had recently hosted a small supper party. Just a few friends and old acquaintances, as he'd put it in his invitations. Among the guests were Mrs. Agatha Fernley, a widow of formidable opinion and more pearls than proper sense, Mr. Hugh Lennox, an old school friend turned solicitor with a suspiciously nervous laugh, Miss Clarice Densham, an aspiring actress with a sultry voice and an unfortunate habit of turning every room into a stage. And finally, young Thomas Grieve, Lancelot's nephew and heir apparent, whose charm was only slightly undermined by gambling debts and whispered misadventures in Monte Carlo. Each of them had been in the house at the time of death. Each had something to gain or lose by Mr. Grieve's untimely demise. Miss Marple heard of it, as she so often did, over tea cakes. "I do hope it wasn't the sherry," murmured Mrs. Bartlett, a neighbour of indiscriminate reliability. "One hears things about foreign liqueurs. I always say, if it's not from Dorset, don't drink it." Miss Marple, seated with her usual gentle composure, stirred her tea with a certain stillness of hand. "You say the study clock chimed, though it hadn't worked in weeks?" "Quite right," said Mrs. Bartlett. "Most odd. Alice the maid was the first to find him, poor girl, dreadfully shaken. And that niece of his, Clarice Densham, you know, she's not a blood relative, but always turning up in the most daring trousers. Well, she fainted, outright. Put her head right on the hearthrug." "Curious," murmured Miss Marple. She went walking later that afternoon, up the footpath near Greystone Manor, her shawl tucked firmly about her shoulders. The village lay quiet under a canopy of early evening mist. She paused by the old milestone, just where the lane turned sharply past the gardener's cottage. A man was there, smoking, Thomas Grieve. He looked startled to see her, then recovered with a half-smile. "Out for your constitutional, Miss Marple?" "Indeed," she said with a polite nod. "And you?" "Smoking to settle your nerves," he laughed, a touch too quickly. "Just thinking." "Ah, dangerous pastime, I'm told." There was a pause. Then gently, "Did your uncle often sit alone in that room with the broken clock?" Thomas hesitated. "Every evening, like ritual. Always 6 o'clock brandy, same chair, same book. He said it was the only time of day he didn't have to pretend." "Pretend what, I wonder?" Miss Marple's eyes, behind the softness of her spectacles, missed nothing. It was not until the next day, after luncheon, that the first false lead came to light. Inspector Cray had found a half-burnt letter in the study grate, torn edges, smudged ink. Only a few words were legible. "Your past in Florence will not remain buried." The suspicion immediately fell upon Miss Densham, whose time in Italy had been the stuff of village whispers. A scandal, an affair, perhaps even a pregnancy. Nothing was confirmed, of course, but the air around her grew noticeably colder. And yet Miss Marple said nothing, only sat on her bench by the rose garden, knitting something grey and shapeless, her eyes half closed as though dozing. But she was not dozing. She was remembering. The clock, the chime, the silence. It was only later, when the doctor confirmed that Lancelot Grieve had not died of poisoning or stroke, but from a blunt force to the back of the head, administered sometime between 6 o'clock and 6:15, that the importance of the chiming clock became clear. It had to be someone who wanted to fix the time of death precisely, Miss Marple later told the inspector. Someone who needed it to appear that Mr. Grieve died at 6 sharp. What better way than to make the broken clock chime again, just once? But how? Simple. A single mechanism inside those old mantel clocks, a tension spring, wound just enough to strike once, if one knows how to release it. And she looked very calmly at Hugh Lennox, the solicitor blanched. "You were the last to see him alive," she said. "You stayed behind under the pretense of discussing the codicil to his will. But in truth, you knew he meant to cut you out entirely. I imagine you wound the spring earlier in the day. One strike, enough to mark the hour." Hugh stammered. "You "There's no proof, but there is motive," said Miss Marple gently. "And murder, Mr. Lennox, is so very rarely about cleverness. It is almost always about fear." The case, of course, was quietly wrapped. The villagers were more cautious in their chatter for a few weeks. Greystone Manor drew its shutters a little tighter, and at exactly 6 o'clock the following Sunday, as the vicar's bell chimed once, Miss Marple sipped her tea and remarked quite mildly that she had never trusted clocks, especially not those that came back to life only to mark a death. Chapter 2. A Body in the Blue Parlour. Greystone Manor hosts an afternoon tea, until a guest fails to rise from her chair. It was one of those golden afternoons that the English countryside seems to produce effortlessly in late June. Sunlight filtered through trees with leaves like old gold, and the bees, drunk on lavender and sweet peas, hummed drowsily between the hedges. In Little Witchford, the ladies had taken to parasols again, and one could smell the heat rising gently from the thatched rooftops of the cottages. Greystone Manor stood in its usual haughty splendor at the edge of the village, its ivy-clad facade basking in the sunshine like a dowager in furs. The lawns had been freshly rolled, and the silver tea service gleamed on the linen-draped table laid in the blue parlour, a room so named not for any melancholy associations, but for the delicate Wedgwood blue silk wallpaper and matching upholstery that had once so impressed a visiting bishop. Afternoon tea at Greystone was something of a tradition. Since the unfortunate death of Mr. Lancelot Grieve the previous month, his nephew Thomas had assumed the hosting duties, though not, it was whispered, with quite the same aplomb. Still, the guest list was correct, the cucumber sandwiches thinly sliced, and the air lightly perfumed with Earl Grey and restrained gossip. Miss Marple, in a floral hat and gloves, sat primly on a Chippendale chair near the window, sipping her tea and surveying the company with mild interest. Present were Mrs. Agatha Fernley, still mourning her second husband, and perhaps not entirely through with a third; the Reverend Prowse, whose wife had taken to evangelical embroidery; young Alice, the maid, who served with trembling hands; Major Liddell, bluff and red-faced, retired from the Punjab, and firmly convinced that none of England's problems had begun before 1914; and, of course, Miss Clarice Densham, reclining with dramatic grace upon a chaise longue, her silk scarf draped just so, and her voice lilting dangerously near the scandalous. Clarice had recently moved into the dower cottage at the edge of the estate, and though her exact relationship with the late Mr. Grieve remained a subject of local speculation, it was generally agreed that she brought a theatrical flair to the village that was both delightful and unsettling. "Such charming weather," she was saying, her voice syrupy, "makes one almost forget that terrible business last month." She fluttered her lashes toward Thomas, who stood awkwardly at the hearth, balancing a teacup and attempting to look dignified. Miss Marple's eyes flicked briefly to the tray of Petit's Fours and then to Clarice's untouched plate. It was a small thing, but she noticed it was just as Reverend Prowse was relating an anecdote about a bee that had flown into the church during last Sunday's sermon, a tale in which the bee, by the third telling, had developed near-human cunning, that Clarice gave a delicate sigh, closed her eyes, and leaned back in her chair. At first, no one noticed. Indeed, it was not until Mrs. Fernley asked her if she'd like another lemon square that the silence became marked. Clarice did not answer. Her chin rested at an angle that suggested sleep, but there was something about the stillness of her hands which rested oddly upon her lap, and the unnatural hue creeping up her neck that made Mrs. Fernley draw back with a cry. "Oh, heavens, She's not breathing." The teacups clattered. The Reverend dropped his napkin. Alice gave a little shriek and fled the room. Thomas stood frozen, then crossed to the chaise and touched Clarice's wrist with an awkward gentleness. "She's dead," he said hoarsely. "Good Lord, she's dead." There was, for a moment, only stunned silence, broken by the distant chiming of the garden clock. The doctor, summoned from 2 villages over, arrived half an hour later in a state of irritation and heat. He examined Clarice with the professional briskness of a man who knew he would shortly be forced to write a letter to the coroner. "Poison," he said. "Something swift? Cyanide, perhaps. We'll know more with the post-mortem." Miss Marple remained seated, her expression unreadable. "Well," muttered Major Little, "someone must have slipped it in her tea. Damned cowardly way to do someone in, if you ask me." "But we all drank the same tea," Thomas said, frowning. "Didn't we?" There was an uneasy murmur. "Except Clarice didn't," said Miss Marple gently. They turned to her. "She hadn't touched her tea. Look at the cup. Full. But she did eat a piece of that cherry sponge, I believe. Just one." Inspector Cray, called in the next morning, went through the motions with his usual gruff courtesy. He questioned the household, examined the tea service, and had the cake samples sent away, though he muttered about the unreliability of such things, especially with icing involved. Each of the guests had remained under a polite sort of suspicion. Mrs. Fernley, though outwardly grief-stricken, had once been overheard describing Clarice as "that theatrical hussy." Major Little had lost a considerable sum to Clarice in a game of bridge the previous week and had not taken it well. The Reverend's wife, who was not present but had reportedly argued with Clarice over her indecent manner of dress, had conveniently developed a headache that day. But it was Thomas who bore the most scrutiny. As her landlord, he had recently presented Clarice with an eviction notice, quietly rescinded the very next day. Miss Marple, who had seen Clarice on the church path that morning, had heard her say, "Oh, he won't dare. I know far too much." "What do you suppose she meant?" asked Inspector Cray when Miss Marple mentioned this little detail. Miss Marple smiled faintly. "It could mean many things, but I think it's always wise to look not at what is said, but what is done." And what had been done, very quietly, was the planting of a jar of wild cherry preserves on the sideboard, the same preserves used in the cake, the same batch prepared by Alice the maid, only a week prior. At first, suspicion fell upon Alice, but Miss Marple, who had once known a woman who poisoned her husband with arsenic baked into blackberry tart, thought otherwise. She asked a simple question. Who had cut and served the cake? Not Alice, Thomas. It was Clarice's favorite, he explained to the inspector. She asked for it specially. But you chose the slice, Miss Marple pointed out. You handed it to her yourself. Thomas said nothing. Miss Marple regarded him gently. I expect she had something on you. Something from before. Something you couldn't afford to have aired in the village, let alone in court. His silence was telling. Later, when he confessed, it emerged that Clarice had discovered the true nature of a financial misstep Thomas had made, one that, if revealed, would have cost him not only the estate, but his freedom. She said she'd expose me, he whispered. She laughed, said it would be my turn next. Miss Marple folded her hands. The guilty are often very bold, Mr. Grieve, but they tend to forget that people notice things, little things, a full teacup, a slice of cake set apart, and a man too nervous to eat what he's served. He stared at her. You didn't touch your own slice, she said simply. You made sure to pass it to the vicar instead. The case made the rounds of village conversation for weeks. Mrs. Fernley declared she would never serve cherry sponge again. Alice was offered a post at the vicarage, and the blue parlour was, from then on, used only for bridge. As for Miss Marple, she returned to her knitting and her herbaceous borders, quietly observing, as she always did, that beneath the charm and roses of an English village there often lies a bed of nettles, carefully hidden, but sharp all the same. Chapter 3. The Time That Wasn't Kept. A stopped clock on the mantel may hold the key to a murder no one saw coming. The villagers of St. Mary Mead had always considered time a steady companion, kept faithfully by church bells, breakfast trays, and the cautious routines of their quiet lives. It was not something one expected to find tampered with, least of all by a murder. The death of Clarice Densham had already cast a long, dark shadow across the summer weeks, but it was the discovery that came the following Sunday which turned speculation into something colder, something altogether more dreadful. The morning began innocently enough. Reverend Prowse gave a sermon on the dangers of deceit, which, while slightly more pointed than usual, went largely unnoticed by the men in the front pews and caused only a small flutter of discomfort among the ladies seated behind Miss Marple. At the tea shop afterwards, the usual suspects discussed rhubarb, German cameras, and the possibility that Mrs. Longhurst's new lodger was not in fact Belgian, but merely from Ipswich. It wasn't until 3 that the news reached Miss Marple, brought by young Ivy Tansley, breathless and flushed. "They've found another one, Miss Marple, at Greystone Manor." Miss Marple looked up from her rose clippings. "Another what, dear?" "Body," Ivy whispered, as though the garden itself might hear. "In the west drawing-room, Mr. Lennox, dead as a doorstop. Hugh Lennox, the solicitor. Quiet, pale, respectable to the point of anonymity. One of the last people Miss Marple would have suspected of becoming part of the village's growing obituary column. By 4 o'clock, Inspector Cray was once more in possession of Greystone's key, and by 5, the drawing-room had been photographed and roped off. The room itself was seldom used, a hushed, somewhat dusty place with dark blue drapes and heavy walnut furniture. Mr. Lennox had apparently been reviewing papers from the estate when he died, slumped over a bureau with a look of mild surprise on his face and a faint bruising on the temple. "No signs of struggle," said Cray, frowning, "but someone gave him a nasty whack with the poker." It was Miss Marple, who had quietly entered with a cup of chamomile tea, prepared by the ever-distraught Alice, who noticed the clock. "It stopped," she remarked, peering up at the mantel, "at precisely 12 minutes past 3. Cray gave it a glance. "Likely it stopped when he fell, knocked something loose." "Possibly," said Miss Marple, "though it seems rather too neatly coincidental. I wonder, was the blow struck at precisely that time?" The doctor, this time from Much Benham, confirmed that death had occurred sometime between 3 and 4 o'clock. Poison was ruled out. A blunt instrument, most likely the poker found resting conspicuously back on its stand. As with the previous incident, there were too many people with too many reasons. Thomas Grieve was seen entering the drawing-room just after 2, ostensibly to retrieve ledgers. He claimed he had left Mr. Lennox alone and had gone to the village to meet a notary, a fact corroborated by the presence of his motor car near the vicarage at 3:30. Mrs. Fernley, indignant as ever, had paid an unexpected visit around the same time. "I had no intention of staying," she told Cray stiffly, "but I simply could not allow Hugh Lennox to go unchallenged regarding the matter of the Dower Cottage tenancy. She left, she insisted, before 3:15. Then, There was young Ivy Tansley, the very girl who had brought the news. She had come to deliver a parcel to the housekeeper and, in her own words, heard a thump from the drawing room as she crossed the back garden. Miss Marple asked ever so gently if Ivy had checked the time. 3:30 it must have been, the girl replied. I'd just passed the station clock and was watching for the post van. It was all very orderly, suspiciously so. The clock, of course, appeared to offer certainty, but Miss Marple, who knew a good many things about certainty and its deceptive nature, studied it more than once that afternoon. She noticed the glass was clean, too clean for a room so rarely used, and the brass knob slightly loose. There was no sign of dust around the keyhole. Later, in conversation with the vicar's wife, she remarked, "It's odd, don't you think, how many people trust clocks to tell the truth? And yet clocks are so easily persuaded to lie. A twist of the hand, a quiet nudge, and time becomes whatever one wants it to be." The murder, it seemed, had been designed around the clock. Miss Marple knew that meant misdirection. She considered the personalities involved. Thomas Grieve, edgy, secretive, possibly guilty of incompetence, but murder. Mrs. Fernley, quick to anger, rigid in her view of morality. She might snap, yes, but premeditated assault seemed outside her rather performative grief. And Ivy, who had arrived breathless, eyes wide, and ever so quick to share her version of events. Miss Marple remembered something curious from an earlier conversation. Ivy's sister Clara had once worked for Mr. Lennox in London. There had been unpleasantness, talk of promises unkept. Clara had returned home in tears, and it was said Mr. Lennox had paid her a modest sum for her discretion. Could Ivy have known? It was not until Miss Marple returned that evening to her own drawing room and examined her own mantel clock, same make, same vintage, that the final piece settled into place. She reached behind the casing, as she had earlier in Greystone Manor, and found the tiny screw that, if loosened just so, would stop the mechanism entirely, without breaking it. Miss Marple called upon Inspector Cray the following morning and asked to speak privately with Ivy. The girl came, nervous and pale. Miss Marple began with a gentle observation. "It's very difficult, isn't it, when someone wrongs the people you love, and there's no justice for it?" Ivy blinked rapidly. "I don't know what you mean." "But you do. You stopped the clock at 3:15. You'd already been inside the room. You knew Mr. Lennox would be there, going over the papers. You waited for your moment. Perhaps you took the poker in panic, but it was no accident." The girl stared at her, trembling. "You planned it carefully," Miss Marple continued. "You even fixed the time, made it seem he died later than he did. That way you could be seen in the garden just after, with your little parcel, as innocent as anything. How could you possibly know?" Miss Marple smiled, gently and terribly kind. "Because, Ivy dear, time was your alibi. But you forgot. Clocks do not lie unless someone tells them to. And in a house full of forgetful people, you were the only one who remembered the exact time of day over and over again. That's not ordinary, that's rehearsed." The confession came then, quiet, bitter, tragic. Ivy had seen her sister suffer. She'd watched Mr. Lennox walk through the village with the same polite smile he wore in court, and she had decided, in her own way, to stop time. The village was unsettled for weeks after. Mrs. Bartlett declared clocks macabre and covered hers with crocheted doilies. The Reverend added an extra prayer for those who twist truth to suit vengeance in his Sunday liturgy. Miss Marple, for her part, returned to her garden, where roses bloomed indifferent to human affairs. She once remarked to her friend Dolly Bantry over seed catalogues. It's rather comforting, don't you think, that truth, like time, may be tampered with, but not forever. And in the hall of Greystone Manor, the clock was repaired, once more keeping time, as it always had. Steady, relentless, watching. Chapter 4. Whispers at the garden wall. Idle gossip in the village turns sinister as secrets begin to sprout among the roses. In St. Mary Mead, gossip was not considered an idle pastime. It was in fact something of a civic duty. At least, that was how it was viewed by the ladies who frequented Mrs. Berridge's tea shop, a snug little establishment tucked between the post office and the greengrocer's, where the lace curtains fluttered like stage wings and the aroma of plum cake mingled delicately with the scent of rose-scented soap. It was here, over pots of Darjeeling and scones, thick with Devonshire cream, that reputations were made, secrets unravelled, and suspicions aired with the faintest hint of floral politeness. And now, of course, there was no shortage of subject matter. 2 deaths in as many weeks, first Miss Densham, then poor Mr. Lennox, and a village that had once taken pride in its orderly churchyard now found itself eyeing neighbours with quiet unease. It was on just such a morning, one bright with bird song and deceptively cheerful, that Mrs. Bartlett leaned across the tea table toward Miss Marple and lowered her voice conspiratorially. "You didn't hear it from me, Jane, but I have it on very good authority. Agatha Fernley was seen arguing with Mr. Lennox not 2 days before his death. Something to do with the dower cottage and unpaid debts. Quite heated, I'm told. Quite unladylike." Miss Marple stirred her tea gently. Heated discussions do happen, even among the respectable, especially where property is concerned, though I must say, Mrs. Fernley has always struck me as a woman of strong conviction, and not overly troubled by propriety when it doesn't suit her purpose. Mrs. Bartlett sniffed. "Still, where there's smoke." "Indeed," murmured Miss Marple, "though one mustn't mistake the smoke from a chimney for that of a fire in the orchard." Outside the tea shop, the village basked in midsummer bloom. The hedgerows had filled in thickly, and the vicarage roses had begun to spill over the low stone wall separating them from the lane, a blaze of crimson and white, scandalously tangled. It was this very wall, in fact, that had become something of an accidental confidant in recent weeks. It divided the Reverend Prowse's garden from that of Greystone Manor's kitchen grounds, and though the vicar's wife might never admit it, she had been known to pause among the foxgloves for rather longer than was strictly necessary when the staff at the manor happened to be taking tea nearby. Miss Marple, who spent a good deal of time tending her delphiniums in the adjoining plot, had heard a few such whispered exchanges herself, voices hushed, but not inaudible, and one in particular had struck her as curious. "I told him I wouldn't be part of it," a woman's voice, shaken, urgent. "You'll do as you're told," came the reply, male and low, "unless you want everything dragged out for her ladyship to hear. I know what you did last winter. Alice—" Miss Marple did not, as a rule, approve of eavesdropping, but she was an excellent gardener, and it had always been her belief that roses bloomed best when tended by those who paid attention to what went on around them. The mention of Alice, young, timid Alice, housemaid at Greystone, brought a flicker of concern. Miss Marple recalled how the girl's hands had trembled while pouring tea, and how she had glanced nervously toward the window every time someone walked past. Later that week, the village was rocked by a third discovery, though not, thankfully, another body. Mrs. Quince, cleaning out the old vestry at the back of St. Catherine's in preparation for the flower festival, came upon a crumpled sheet of paper tucked inside a discarded hymnal. It was a letter, torn and unsigned, but unmistakably written in a woman's hand. You think you can use what happened in Brighton to threaten me, but I've kept your secrets too. If anything happens to me, the truth will come out. The letter made its way via 2 vicars and 1 slightly confused curate to Inspector Cray, who read it aloud at the village hall in a voice tinged with reluctant admiration. "Brighton, eh?" said Major Liddell afterwards, wagging his pipe. "Nothing good ever comes from Brighton." The list of suspects, once narrow, now swelled with every whisper and sideways glance. There was Alice, of course, perhaps involved in some sordid business in Brighton, and now blackmailed into silence. Thomas Grieve, already tarnished by the scandal surrounding his late uncle's will, seemed uncommonly eager to have the matter closed. And then there was Mrs. Fernley, whose insistence on appearing innocent had begun to seem rather too well rehearsed. Red herrings swam thickly through the village lanes, a pair of gloves found behind the parish hall, a half-burnt will hidden in the grate, a smear of rouge on a collar not belonging to the late Miss Densham. But Miss Marple, as always, observed quietly. She did not rush. She knitted, she weeded, she walked to the baker's on Thursdays, and she listened. The clue, when it came, was something no one else noticed. A gap in the garden wall behind the vicarage. Not large, just enough for someone slim to slip through without being seen. And near that gap, the imprint of a heel. Not a man's boot, a woman's. Miss Marple paid a quiet visit to Alice that evening. "My dear," she said kindly, "it's very hard, isn't it, when one makes a mistake and someone tries to use it against you? Brighton can be a terrible place for a girl alone." Alice blinked, eyes wide. How could you possibly?" Miss Marple smiled. "One learns a great deal, my dear, by tending a garden. Secrets don't stay buried long in soil that rich, especially when people insist on whispering things they believe no one hears." The story spilled out then. Alice's foolish trust in a man who had promised her London and a ring. How Mr. Lennox, of all people, had learned of it and threatened to reveal it unless she helped him forge the codicil in Mr. Grieve's will, and how someone else had overheard everything and used it. "That's why you were frightened," said Miss Marple softly. "Not of Mr. Lennox, but of whoever threatened you after his death." Alice nodded. "He said, I don't know who he was, but he knew everything. Said he'd tell her ladyship. Said I'd go to prison." "He won't tell anyone," Miss Marple said gently, "because he's already told too much, and once a liar talks too loudly, my dear, the truth becomes unavoidable." Later that week, Miss Marple met Inspector Cray outside the parish gates. "It's Thomas Grieve," she said quietly. He saw an opportunity when he overheard Mr. Lennox pressuring Alice, and when Clarice Densham threatened to expose him, he silenced her too. The letter was a bluff, written by Alice in desperation. But the real mistake Thomas made was not in what he said, but where he said it. Cray blinked. "The garden wall?" "Yes," said Missy Marple. "It's very thin stone, and voices carry." The arrest was discreet, the scandal less so. The roses behind the vicarage wall continued to bloom, careless of the turmoil they had witnessed. And at Mrs. Berridge's tea shop, the conversation returned to more acceptable fare: rhubarb, lace patterns, and whether the new grocer's boy was too handsome for his own good. Miss Marple, sipping her tea and folding her knitting with quiet precision, only remarked that while walls might not have ears, they certainly heard more than people thought, especially in a village where even secrets had a habit of blooming among the roses. Chapter 5. An invitation to silence. A missing letter, an unspoken warning, and the silence of someone who knows too much. It was just past 9 on a Wednesday morning when Miss Marple noticed that the usual post was late. Not abominably so. It was only 7 minutes past the hour. But in St. Mary Mead, where the day ticked forward with the gentle inevitability of scones rising in an oven, such a delay was something of a disruption. She sat, as she often did, in her front parlour, with her needlework balanced neatly upon her lap and her spectacles low upon her nose. The breeze carried in the scent of sweet alyssum from the garden border, and the soft whuff of Mr. Toffee's bicycle tires along Church Lane floated faintly through the open window. But there was no thump of letters in the box, no polite rattle of hinges. A curious thing, and it would have passed, perhaps, with no more than a raised eyebrow and an extra row of stitches, had it not been for what followed an hour later. Mrs. Edna Cribbs arrived at Miss Marple's gate in some distress, her hat slightly askew and her complexion an alarming shade of lavender. She was clutching her handbag as though it contained state secrets. "Jane," she whispered without preamble, have you by any chance seen this morning's post?" "No, Edna," Miss Marple said mildly, rising to let her in. "In fact, I was just remarking upon its absence." Mrs. Cribbs pursed her lips. "Well, something's gone awry, that's certain. My husband, Mr. Cribbs, you understand, received an envelope this morning. Plain. No return address. Inside was nothing. Simply a blank sheet. Folded. But that's not all." She paused, drawing out the moment with practiced, dramatic flair. "He wasn't meant to get it." Miss Marple inclined her head. "How so?" "It had been opened already, resealed rather sloppily. And the postmark, well, Jane, it was from here." From the village, Miss Marple's needles paused for the briefest moment. "Interesting," she said. "Do sit, Edna. I find scandal is better endured with a touch of sponge cake." The missing letter, and it soon became clear that one had indeed gone missing, belonged not to Mr. Cribbs at all, but to Miss Marple's neighbour, Miss Letitia Blackwood. Letitia lived alone, in a narrow, ivy-clad cottage 2 doors down. She was a woman of remarkable discretion, a retired governess of the old school who had once taught in Vienna and always wore gloves, even when hanging out the washing. Letitia had never been one for village chatter, but her sudden absence from the Thursday sewing circle was remarked upon with increasing concern, particularly when Alice, the maid from Greystone Manor, confided to Mrs. Bartlett that Miss Blackwood had been terribly pale and had refused her usual order of anchovy toast from the tea shop. By Friday, rumours had begun to curl like smoke through the hedgerows. "She's been threatened, I say," declared Major Little with relish. "Happens all the time. War, secrets, foreign spies. Mark my words, someone doesn't want her talking." But it was Miss Marple who recalled something far more mundane and far more dangerous. She had once observed, months earlier, that Miss Blackwood received regular correspondence from a solicitor's office in London. An unremarkable thing, until one considered that Mr. Hugh Lennox, recently deceased in rather dramatic circumstances, had once served as a junior partner there, and had made a quiet career of managing the more sensitive affairs of his clients. "I wonder," said Miss Marple, sipping her tea, "if the letter that was not received by Miss Blackwood was one of those confidential sorts, and whether, in fact, it contained information someone would go to great lengths to keep quiet." That same evening, Letitia Blackwood was found unconscious at the foot of her cellar stairs. The doctor said it was a simple fall. Nothing broken, though she had struck her head rather nastily on the stone step. She would recover, but not for some time. And when she did, she remembered nothing of the hour before her accident. It was Alice, again, who noticed something strange. "She's usually so tidy, Miss Blackwood," she told Miss Marple, "but when I went to put away her tray, there were tea leaves all over the counter, as if she'd made the pot in a hurry, and her sugar tin was open. She always puts it away." "And the letter?" Miss Marple asked quietly. Alice hesitated. "Gone, I think. She had it tucked behind the clock, on the mantel. Said she'd deal with it after supper, but it wasn't there the next morning. A blank sheet, a missed letter, a woman too frightened to speak. The pattern was forming, but not yet clear." Miss Marple took a walk in the dusk, the air scented with honeysuckle and the soft tang of cut grass. She paused, quite naturally, near the back gate of Greystone Manor, where Thomas Grieve stood smoking with an air of affected calm. "It's quite the thing, all these letters going astray," she said, her tone gently conversational. "And people falling downstairs. One begins to wonder if there's something very unpleasant being passed around." Thomas exhaled slowly. "Village nonsense. They'll be accusing me next." "Oh," said Miss Marple, "but they already have." He turned, startled. "Not publicly, of course," she went on, "but that's how these things begin, isn't it? First whispers, then silence. But the truth always insists on being heard, especially when someone tries so very hard to keep it quiet." She let that settle, like the last crumble of biscuit in a saucer. On Sunday afternoon, Miss Marple paid a quiet visit to Letitia, who had regained enough strength to sit up in bed and take weak tea with lemon. "My dear," said Miss Marple gently, "I believe someone sent you a letter, one you were never meant to receive. And I believe that letter contained something damaging to Mr. Lennox, possibly a confession or an attempt at blackmail." Letitia's pale face stiffened. "You were going to say nothing," Miss Marple continued, "but your silence, though well-intended, nearly got you killed." Letitia said nothing. Miss Marple smiled sadly. "I once knew a girl who worked as a governess in Vienna during a time when secrets could get people shot. She told me that truth was safest when it was whispered in the garden, not written in a letter." Letitia's hands trembled. "It was about Clarice," she whispered, "and Thomas, and the will." It unraveled quickly after that. The letter, written by Mr. Lennox just days before his death, had been an admission, a veiled confession of forged papers, changed bequests, and hush money paid to silence Clarice Densham. He had intended to send it to Letitia, his last honest client, as if hoping to unburden himself. But it had never arrived. Someone, Thomas, as it turned out, had intercepted it at the post office by charming the assistant into handing it over under pretense of errand. He resealed it, sent an empty note to Mr. Cribbs to throw off the trail, and paid a visit to Letitia under the guise of apology, ensuring she slipped on the steps before she could say anything. When confronted, Thomas denied everything, until Miss Marple revealed she had retrieved the burned remains of the original letter from the garden incinerator, tucked deep inside a scorched envelope that still bore traces of Mr. Lennox's monogram. He broke then, as all guilty men eventually do, when faced not with force, but quiet, relentless truth. And so, the silence ended. The village sighed its relief. The roses bloomed again. The post returned to its punctuality, and Miss Marple, with a new tin of shortbread beside her and a fresh ball of yarn on her lap, only remarked that letters are very much like people, best not lost and almost always carrying more than they show on the surface. Chapter 6. The Vicar's Second Glance. A pious man sees something in the shadows and chooses not to tell the truth. The early days of September brought a gentler sun to Saint Mary Mead, less boastful than August, a touch more golden, and edged faintly with the coming hush of autumn. The first leaves had begun to bronze at the corners, and the air smelled faintly of turned earth and ripe plums. Reverend Leonard Prowse, vicar of St. Catherine's for nearly a decade, had taken to walking the village paths in the early evenings, ostensibly for reflection, though more often in quiet evasion of his wife's embroidery circle. The Reverend was a thoughtful, slightly diffident man, with the kind of mild face that easily passed unnoticed, an attribute he had often found more useful than it appeared. It was on one such walk, along the winding lane behind the Greystone Manor estate, that he saw it, or rather saw something. A figure, bent low and deliberate, moving along the privet hedge bordering the south garden. The light was dimming, dusk blurring edges, but there was a stillness in the figure's movements that struck him oddly, as though they were listening rather than acting. Reverend Prowse paused by the old wrought-iron gate that separated the footpath from the garden and squinted. He knew that hedge. Knew, too, that it led directly toward the old conservatory, where the late Mr. Grieve had kept a variety of unsavory ledgers and brandy bottles disguised as bonsai tonic. He considered stepping forward, calling out, but something in him, some deep, clerical instinct for avoiding embarrassment, held him back. After a moment, the figure slipped away toward the rear of the house, vanishing into deeper shadow. By the next morning, the murder had occurred. It was Mrs. Flora Winstanley, Greystone's long-time housekeeper, who was found at the bottom of the cellar steps, her neck twisted at an unnatural angle, and her hand clutched tightly around a crumpled page torn from a journal. She had not been a popular woman, but her sudden, violent end shocked even those who had long called her a stone-hearted penny-pincher. The doctor, with a professional sigh, pronounced it a fall, possibly brought on by the weak ankle she was known to complain of, but the bruising on her shoulder and the fact that the stair lamp had been unscrewed suggested something more deliberate. Inspector Cray arrived from Much Benham, looking increasingly harassed. "One might expect this sort of thing in London," he muttered to Miss Marple as they stood in the gloomy hallway of Greystone. "But 3 suspicious deaths in a village like this? It's positively indecent." Miss Marple, who was inspecting the edge of a Persian rug with careful interest, murmured, "Murder, Inspector, is often most at home, where the front doors are well painted and the gardens are neatly trimmed. You mustn't let the hydrangeas deceive you." The crumpled page in Mrs. Winstanley's hand turned out to be more than a curiosity. Written in her unmistakably spidery hand were a few cryptic lines. "He thinks it's hidden, but I saw him near the garden wall. If anything happens, look in the green box." No green box was found, nor, it seemed, was anyone aware of what the note referred to. The staff, few as they were, claimed ignorance. Thomas Grieve, now reluctantly head of the household, insisted he had never seen a green box of any sort and suggested that the housekeeper, advanced in years, might have become confused. Miss Marple did not comment, but she did, on the next morning, visit the vicarage. "I wonder," she said gently, as she took tea with the Reverend beneath the vine-covered trellis, "whether you happened to be walking near Greystone the evening before Mrs. Winstanley died." The Reverend, who had just buttered a scone with reverential care, looked up quickly. Yes, I believe I was," he said after a moment. a short stroll after supper. You didn't happen to see anyone? There was a pause. No, he said. No, I don't believe I did. It was a small lie, a harmless one perhaps, but it sat oddly in Miss Marple's mind, like a slightly crooked picture on a perfectly white wall. She left shortly thereafter, smiling politely and remarking on the quality of the lemon curd, but her thoughts were elsewhere. Reverend Prowse had lied, not clumsily, but carefully, which meant that what he had seen had been something worth lying about. It was on Sunday afternoon, during a lull in the Harvest Festival preparations, that Miss Marple found the box. It had been tucked into the space beneath the conservatory's old potting bench, green, wooden, and rusted at the hinges. It had likely been there for years, unnoticed among the dusty plant pots and disused tools. Inside, folded neatly, were pages torn from an accounts ledger, each one marked with initials and sums of money, large sums, tied to names both familiar and unfamiliar. At the very bottom, pressed beneath the stack, like a signature, was a faded envelope, addressed in Hugh Lennox's hand. The contents were enough to confirm what Miss Marple had already suspected. That afternoon, she returned to the vicarage. "I believe," she said, seated once more beneath the trellis, "that you saw Thomas Grieve near the conservatory, that he had something in his hands, perhaps a small green box, and that you chose not to say anything." The Reverend looked at her, then away. His hands trembled slightly on the teacup. "I didn't want to get involved, Jane," he said, not unkindly. "It's not cowardice, at least I hope not. But I've seen what suspicion does to a place, and he's one of ours. I thought perhaps it was nothing." "But you knew it wasn't," she said quietly. He closed his eyes. "Yes." Miss Marple reached into her handbag and withdrew one of the ledger pages. "He was blackmailing her," she said. "Clarice Densham too, and perhaps others. Hugh Lennox was part of it. He managed the paperwork, but Thomas reaped the benefit. When Flora Winstanley discovered the ledgers, she must have threatened to expose him. And so she died for it. Pushed, I think. The unscrewed stair lamp was clever, but not clever enough. Inspector Cray was discreet. The arrest was made quietly, just before evensong. Thomas Grieve protested with all the rage of a man who believes he has been wronged by the very people he once manipulated. Miss Marple said nothing of the Reverend's earlier silence, but that evening, as she walked home, along the lane behind Greystone Manor, she paused at the iron gate and looked toward the darkening garden. "Second glances," she murmured to herself, "are often more revealing than first ones, especially when one chooses not to look too closely the first time." The shadows deepened, the leaves rustled softly, and in the stillness of early nightfall, the village of St. Mary Mead settled once more into the uneasy quiet of a place that had for a moment peered into its own soul and looked quickly away. Chapter 7. Footsteps across the frost. Early morning tracks lead away from the manor and vanish into the fog. The frost came early to St. Mary Mead that year, unexpected and sharp, blanketing the village in a fine crystalline lace that clung to rooftops and curled round chimney pots like spun glass. The air was clean and still, and the crunch of gravel beneath one's feet echoed with the sort of intimacy that only winter brings. From her bedroom window at Danebury Cottage, Miss Marple observed the silvery lawn with quiet satisfaction, noting the bird bath glazed with ice and the faint trail of cat paw prints along the low stone wall. She liked mornings such as these. They were honest in their way, revealing who had passed where and when, and leaving behind evidence the most cunning boot could not erase. But this morning was different. This morning Miss Marple's keen blue eyes narrowed, for on the distant path leading down from Greystone Manor, she saw something troubling. Footprints, a single set, deep and precise, marching across the frost-covered grass. They led away from the manor's side door, used by staff and tradesmen, and disappeared abruptly near the edge of the woods, where the frost had already melted into slush beneath the low-hanging fog. By mid-morning, the peace of the village had once again been broken. It was Elsie Tarrant, the gardener's daughter, who had raised the alarm. She had come to Greystone to collect a parcel for the vicarage, only to find the back door swinging open and the house curiously still. Inside, lying crumpled at the base of the old servants' staircase, was Henry Calthorpe, Greystone's handyman of many decades, a quiet, stooped man of 70 who could fix a squeaky hinge or retile a hearth without fuss or thanks. He had, until this morning, been very much alive. Inspector Cray arrived with his usual blend of grim resolve and mild indigestion, having been roused from his breakfast at the King's Arms. The body bore no sign of violent struggle, save for a bruising at the back of the head and a trickle of dried blood beneath the ear. "The banister's loose," he said, running a meaty hand over the smooth wood. "Could have slipped." Miss Marple, who had arrived shortly after, examined the staircase with a frown. "Mr. Calthorpe suffered from a stiffness in his left leg," she said. "It made him quite cautious on stairs. I doubt he would have hurried." "Then perhaps he was pushed." Miss Marple nodded slowly. "Yes, but if so, why here, and why now?" The trail outside drew more interest. The prints were indeed Henry's. Inspector Cray had matched them against the boots left near the kitchen door. But why he had left the house at such an early hour, and what he had done before returning, no one could say. Thomas Grieve, now reluctantly installed as master of Greystone, claimed to know nothing. He had risen late and found the police already at his door. He looked unshaven and disordered, and his voice trembled when he asked if Henry had said anything before he died. "Curious question," Miss Marple noted quietly later that afternoon to the vicar's wife, almost as if he expected there had been a last word. The household was questioned, of course. Alice, the maid, pale as chalk and jittery as a bird, said she'd heard nothing in the night. Mrs. Winstanley's replacement, a severe woman named Miss Rudge, insisted she had been in her room since supper, reading from the Psalms. Both had seen Henry the day before, moving flower pots in the conservatory and muttering about rot in the timbers near the chapel wing. It was Ivy Tansley who first mentioned the box. "A green tin, miss," she told Miss Marple, outside the post office. "Henry carried it everywhere of late. Said he'd found something under the floorboards. But when I asked what, he just smiled that odd little smile and said, 'Some things are best kept shut unless you're ready for the stink.'" The box, naturally, was gone. Miss Marple visited Greystone again that evening, ostensibly to offer her condolences to the staff. She made a point of asking about the household's sleeping arrangements and, with gentle persistence, inquired about the laundry. It was Alice, grateful for kindness, who confided that Miss Rudge had taken a dressing gown to the wash that very morning, despite having worn her thick shawl all day and never being seen in her bedroom until after the commotion. "And she keeps that dreadful perfume in her room," Alice added, "the sort that smells like orange blossom and vinegar." Miss Marple smiled. Orange blossom, a scent she had smelled before, once on the morning air. That night, the fog thickened, the temperature dropped, and Miss Marple did what she had always done best, she thought. The next day, with quiet authority, she returned to the manor and asked to speak with Miss Rudge. The housekeeper, composed and grim as ever, received her stiffly. "I wonder," Miss Marple said, "if you might help me settle a little question. Henry's footprints led away from the house, but not back. And yet we found him at the bottom of the stairs, so either he vanished or someone followed him, wearing the same boots." Miss Rudge's expression did not change. "I wouldn't know about that." "No?" Miss Marple tilted her head. "And yet you washed your dressing gown this morning. Curious. I imagine it had frost on the hem." The woman's eyes flickered. "You followed him," Miss Marple continued softly. "He confided something to you about the ledgers, the box, perhaps even a letter. Something worth silencing him for. You took the boots from the kitchen, followed his trail, and met him near the woods. Perhaps he refused to give you the box. Perhaps you argued. Then, when he returned inside, already shaken, you followed and ensured he would never speak again." Miss Rudge's composure cracked. "His kind always talk," she hissed. "He couldn't help himself, poking around, asking questions. He found the box, said he'd hand it over, but it wasn't his to handle. It wasn't—" Her voice broke off. Inspector Cray, who had been listening from the next room, stepped forward and took her gently by the arm. Later, Miss Marple stood once more by the frosted lawn, watching the pale sun warm the earth. "Footprints are terribly revealing," she said to the vicar's wife, who stood beside her, subdued. "They show us the way forward, but also the way back, unless someone carefully obscures the return." The frost was melting now, the grass softening, and though the fog still hung low among the trees, the path beyond Greystone Manor was once again clear, its secrets for now laid bare beneath the quiet light of a winter morning. Chapter 8. China Cups and Crooked Lies. Over tea and scones, old resentments slip out like poison in a cup. It was a Wednesday, cool and bright, and the window panes at the front of Mrs. Berridge's tea room shimmered in the autumn sun. Outside, the leaves along the green had turned, setting the village ablaze with gold and copper, and the ivy climbing the post office gable was the color of a well-aged claret. Inside, there was warmth, the scent of buttered scones, and the soft murmur of conversation, just loud enough to drown out what should not be overheard, and just quiet enough to make sure that nothing truly escaped notice. Miss Marple sat at her customary table near the window, her knitting bag tucked beneath her chair, a fresh pot of Earl Grey before her. Across from her sat Mrs. Agatha Fernley, a woman of uncompromising views and a habit of straightening silverware as she spoke. "It's not the first time Thomas Greaves made a mess of things," Agatha said briskly, adjusting her teaspoon by a quarter inch. "He was always too clever by half, taking on more than he could manage, promising what he couldn't possibly deliver. I remember his mother, poor thing, always making apologies." Miss Marple smiled gently, "and yet one wonders why so many people still trust him." Agatha sniffed. "Habit, I suppose, or foolishness, or both." Just then, the door jingled, and in came Clarissa Hepplewhite, the spinster who ran the telephone exchange and had ears better tuned than any broadcasting set in Hampshire. She was followed by Miss Rudge, pale-faced and newly dismissed from her brief post at Greystone Manor, and Mr. Sims, the village chemist, who never visited the tea-room unless he had heard something worth eavesdropping on. By 3:30, the tea-room was full, every table neatly occupied, every cup chinking politely. But beneath the surface, there was tension, a kind of brittle alertness, like the first crack on fine porcelain. Miss Marple, whose needles moved rhythmically, noticed how Clarissa's gaze kept drifting toward Miss Rudge, and how Miss Rudge, in turn, refused to meet anyone's eyes. It was then that the tray arrived. A fresh round of scones, plump and warm, accompanied by strawberry jam and clotted cream. Mrs. Berridge herself carried them to Miss Marple's table, her face flushed with the effort. "Special batch," she said with a forced smile. "From Alice at Greystone. Brought in this morning, insisted I try them." Miss Marple's eyes lingered on the plate. "Very kind of her," she said softly. A moment later, just as Miss Rudge reached for her cup, her hand trembled violently. The cup clattered into the saucer, and a thin splash of tea streaked across the white linen cloth. She mumbled an apology, stood up too quickly, and stumbled from the room with a muffled sob. "Poor soul," murmured Mrs. Bartlett from the far table. "You know, she's never been the same since that business with the green box." But Miss Marple had already risen. She caught up to Miss Rudge outside, beneath the shade of the copper beech. "My dear," she said kindly, "might I suggest a quiet turn around the green?" The two women walked slowly. Miss Rudge's hands were clenched in her coat pockets, and her eyes were red-rimmed. "I shouldn't have come," she said. "Not here. Not after everything." "You've done nothing wrong," Miss Marple replied gently. "But it seems to me someone very much wants you to feel as though you have." Miss Rudge stopped. "You mean the tea?" Miss Marple nodded. "You didn't drink it, of course, but you recognize something?" "A scent," she whispered. "Almond. Just a trace. I know it." "Bitter almonds," Miss Marple said softly. "Cyanide, you see. A dangerous thing in careless hands, though very effective in careful ones." Miss Rudge turned pale. "Someone," Miss Marple continued, "wanted it to look like you meant to harm yourself. Or worse, someone else. But it was meant for you, I believe. A warning. A test, perhaps. To see what you'd do." They walked in silence for a moment longer, before Miss Rudge spoke again. "It's Thomas," she said. "It has to be. After Henry died, I found something. An envelope hidden in a box of kindling. It was addressed to Hugh Lennox. Inside was a receipt for a payment. £300, made to Clarice Densham. Hush money. I was going to bring it to the police. But Thomas, he knew. And he made sure," Miss Marple said, "that you were too frightened to act." Later that evening, after dusk had fallen and the tea shop had closed its shutters for the night, Miss Marple sat with Inspector Cray in her parlour. "I don't believe he intended to kill her," she said. "Not yet. It was meant to unnerve, to isolate. And of course, it could be blamed on her hysteria. How often poison and panic go hand in hand." Cray grunted. "You're certain it was Grieve?" Miss Marple gave a small nod. "The scones were from Greystone, but Alice never made them. She says so plainly in her note, which means someone brought them from the manor and claimed she had. And only one person had access to both the kitchen and Mrs. Berridge's storeroom, and the knowledge of Miss Rudge's habits. A careful cup," she added softly, "intended for just the right lips." That week, Thomas Grieve was called in for questioning, on suspicion not of murder, but of attempted poisoning. The ledger pages recovered earlier now joined hands with financial records long buried, and a picture emerged of a man who had engineered more than one death, and who had finally, over tea and scones, revealed his hand too openly. The village, shaken, but secretly vindicated, returned to its routine. The tea-room reopened, the china cups were scoured, and a fresh batch of scones was baked by Mrs. Berridge herself, with no help from anyone. Miss Marple, when later offered one, accepted politely, but smiled as she passed her cup to the vicar's wife and remarked, "One must always be cautious, my dear. It's not the bitterness in the cup that surprises, it's the sweetness that hides it." Chapter 9. The Portrait with Watching Eyes. In the library, a centuries-old painting seems to observe more than just the room. It was a still, grey afternoon at Greystone Manor, the sort that pressed close to the windows and dimmed the lamps even at midday. A light drizzle clung to the ivy-covered walls, and the distant hills, usually so crisp in autumn, blurred into a painterly haze of browns and tarnished golds. Inside, the fire in the library had burned down to a bed of quiet embers, casting faint shadows across the wood-panelled room. Miss Marple sat near the hearth, a shawl across her lap, and her knitting needles idle in her hands. Her eyes, however, were not on her wool, but on the large portrait hanging above the marble mantelpiece. It depicted a man in 18th-century dress, red velvet coat, powdered wig, one gloved hand resting on a globe, the other on a leather-bound folio. The plaque beneath it read, "Sir Alaric Grieve, 1761 to 1812, and the face was sharp, almost hawkish, with eyes that seemed too alive for oil and canvas. "They say he was a terrible man," murmured Mrs. Fernley from her chair across the room. "Hung his own steward, if the stories are true. Quite the family legacy." Miss Marple nodded absently. "One often finds such portraits deeply expressive, don't you think? Eyes painted to follow one about the room. Unsettling to some, though I always find they reveal more than they conceal." The conversation turned, as it always did in those days, to the murders. 3 now, with one attempted poisoning and a trail of evidence that pointed in every direction and none at all. Inspector Cray, though dogged, had grown visibly wearier with each visit, and Miss Marple had noted that he now accepted tea with a sigh and a faraway look, as if even the scones had become suspicious. It was in that very library, just 3 nights earlier, that someone had died. Jonathan Eyre, archivist, visiting scholar, and a rather dishevelled guest of Thomas, Grieve, had been found slumped in the armchair nearest the window, his hand resting on a copy of the Grieve Lineage and Holdings, 1683 to 1899, and a glass of sherry untouched on the side table. At first glance, a heart attack had seemed the obvious cause. He was pale, soft-spoken, prone to long nights and strong tobacco. But Dr. Whitby, ever cautious, had noticed the faint trace of foam at the corner of his mouth, and the distinct, bitter scent of something wrong in the air. "You think it's the same poison?" Inspector Cray had asked Miss Marple, his brow furrowed. "I think," Miss Marple had replied, "that someone was growing bolder and desperate." Jonathan Eyre had come to Greystone under the pretext of cataloguing the family's dusty papers, but he had, it seemed, discovered something quite different. Miss Marple had watched him often from her place in the library, fidgeting with documents, glancing at the portrait of Sir Alaric as if expecting a rebuke, and once notably sliding a slim, black notebook into his coat pocket when he thought no one was looking. That notebook, of course, had vanished. Thomas Grieve claimed ignorance. Miss Rudge swore she hadn't stepped into the library for days. Alice was shaken, but insisted she'd only come in to dust and hadn't touched a thing. The vicar's wife, who had been seated beside the fire the morning after the murder, mentioned quite innocently that the portrait seemed to look particularly grim of late. Miss Marple had said nothing at the time, but the comment stayed with her. That afternoon, while tea was being served in the blue parlour, Miss Marple returned to the library and stood before the painting. The eyes did follow one around the room. It was the technique, she knew, but there was more to it than that. She stepped onto the small footstool used to reach the upper shelves and examined the frame closely. A slight distortion in the paneled wall behind the portrait caught her eye. A faint seam in the oak, no thicker than a hairline. With careful hands, she pressed gently near the base. There was a soft click, and the panel swung open an inch. Behind it, tucked into the cavity, was the missing notebook. She opened it. Inside were pages of dates, initials, odd notations in a tight hand. There were sums of money, references to the estate, and at the back, a short paragraph in Eyre's own writing. Letter of 1892 confirms line of inheritance bypassed. Illegitimate son acknowledged privately. Current title improperly claimed. Evidence to follow. God help me. Miss Marple closed the notebook slowly. It explained everything. The inheritance, the deaths, and Thomas's increasing anxiety as his position began to unravel beneath him. That evening, she asked to speak with him privately in the library. "You've been terribly unfortunate," she said gently, "to have inherited a house so full of ghosts, some made of paint, others of paper." Thomas, pale and fidgeting, gave her a guarded look. "What are you implying, Miss Marple?" "Only that the dead do not stay quiet when the truth is kept from them. Mr. Eyre knew something that would have removed your claim to Greystone altogether." "You've no proof." She handed him the notebook. "On the contrary, I believe this is precisely what you've been trying to find." He hesitated. Then he reached for the fire. "No, I shouldn't," she said gently. "Inspector Cray is just outside, and it would be dreadfully awkward if you were to burn the only evidence tying you to the deaths of Eyre, Clarice Densham, and poor Mr. Lennox." He stared at her, mouth slightly open. "You see," Miss Marple continued, "it was always the painting that gave you away. You moved it, didn't you, searching behind? But the dust at the base was disturbed, and the stool placed a fraction to the left. Not something most would notice, but Sir Alaric always frowned a little more when things were amiss." Thomas said nothing more. He was led out of the house the next morning, under quiet escort. Miss Marple remained behind for a time, standing once more before the portrait. The rain had stopped, and in the watery light from the tall windows, Sir Alaric's eyes seemed almost satisfied. "I've always said," she murmured, as Alice brought in her tea, "that people don't watch portraits. It's the other way round." Chapter 10. A turn of the key. A hidden drawer, a secret compartment, and a diary that shouldn't exist. There are moments in every old house when time seems to pause, not out of dread or wonder, but because the walls themselves are holding their breath. At Greystone Manor, this moment came just after 6 o'clock on a Thursday evening, when the last light filtered through the stained glass fanlight above the staircase, and the hush of the household deepened into something more knowing. Miss Marple had been invited to tea, an invitation delivered not by Thomas Grieve, who was now a guest of His Majesty's Constabulary, but by his cousin, Evelyn Grieve, recently arrived from Bath to see to the estate in the wake of her family's disgrace. A tall, angular woman, with the look of a Roman empress left out in the rain, Miss Grieve possessed the sort of poise that made everyone else adjust their posture, without quite knowing why. They had taken tea in the small parlour, scones, modestly buttered, and a rather sharp lemon drizzle cake, and discussed daffodils, law clerks, and the deplorable state of parish bookkeeping. "I don't know how you stand it," Evelyn said, her voice clipped. "This air of smug country decay. I imagine one comes to appreciate the stillness." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Stillness is rarely what it appears, my dear. Sometimes it's only the silence before something dreadful is remembered. At that, Evelyn had blinked, just once, and reached for her teacup with a tremor barely noticeable to most. But Miss Marple, who could detect a lie by the rustle of a cuff, tucked the moment away in her mind. They parted shortly after, but Miss Marple did not leave at once. Instead, she wandered back into the Manor's library under the pretext of retrieving a shawl she had not, in fact, brought with her. The room was empty. The fire had been laid, but not lit, and a faint draught moved the heavy curtain near the south-facing window. She turned toward the writing desk. It was an impressive piece, oak, heavily carved, with brass fittings and a row of pigeonholes behind a roll-top cover. On the surface lay several items, an inkwell, an address book, a small tray for correspondence, and an assortment of mismatched keys, as if someone had taken to trying, each in turn, and given up in a mild huff. One drawer was locked. Miss Marple did not try it. Instead, she reached for the small brass box nearby, one she had noticed on her last visit. It had once belonged to Clarice Densham. According to Alice the maid, Clarice had kept sentimental trinkets in it, love notes, opera tickets, and once a withered sprig of lavender. Miss Marple opened the box. It was empty, save for a key. A small, unassuming key. One that would not open anything as grand as a safe, but perhaps something subtler. She turned back to the desk. It took no more than a moment. The key turned with a soft click, and the drawer eased open. Inside lay a sheaf of papers tied with faded ribbon, a packet of letters bound together with black sealing wax, and at the bottom, wrapped in oilskin, a diary. It was not Clarice's diary, nor Evelyn's. It was older than that. ELG read the initials stamped into the leather. Edward Lionel Grieve. Miss Marple sat very still. She opened the cover. The writing was bold, hurried in places, meticulously neat in others. She read a few lines, then a few more. Her brow furrowed. The diary, clearly hidden with care, contained an account of an affair. A child, assistant A, quietly buried scandal. Edward Lionel Grieve, the former master of Greystone, had fathered a son with a housemaid in 1891. The child, it appeared, had been raised in the village under another name, provided for discreetly, though never formally acknowledged. There were references, veiled but unmistakable, to bribes paid to the mother, to a letter written and later destroyed, and to a promise made that no child of the household would inherit Greystone while the rightful heir lived and breathed. Miss Marple closed the diary softly. That promise had not been kept. The boy, now a man, had disappeared into obscurity. But somewhere along the line, someone had discovered the truth. Perhaps Lennox, the solicitor. Perhaps Eyre, the archivist. Perhaps even Clarice Densham, who had a way of unearthing things best left buried, each of them now dead. The diary should not have existed. That it did was dangerous, fatal even. As Miss Marple slipped the diary back into its wrappings and relocked the drawer, she heard the faint creak of a floorboard behind her. Evelyn stood in the doorway, one gloved hand resting on the frame. "I wondered," she said coolly, "how long it would take." Miss Marple turned, unruffled. "I believe you were aware of the diary." "I was. You moved it, I expect. After Eyre died?" "Yes. And you've read it?" "Of course. My father's hand was unmistakable. I found it the week Thomas was arrested." I said nothing. "Why?" Evelyn stepped into the room. "Because there was no one left to tell. And because—" her voice grew quiet. "The child was my half-brother. I knew his name. I remember him, faintly. My mother never did forgive him." "And the murders?" Evelyn looked directly at her. "I had no part in them, Miss Marple. I did not poison Lennox or Clarice. I did not strike Eyre, but I did keep silent, because I believed it was already too late to do anything else." Miss Marple rose from the chair. "The truth," she said softly, "always arrives, eventually. Sometimes by letter, sometimes in whispers, and sometimes with a turn of the key." That evening, she gave the diary to Inspector Cray, who read it with heavy eyebrows and a muttered oath. No charges were brought against Evelyn Grieve. There was no proof, only the sharp outline of knowledge withheld. But Greystone's lineage and its dark little scandal became an open secret among the village's quieter circles. Mrs. Bartlett declared it a shocking business and ordered a new lock for her recipe drawer. Mrs. Berridge served cinnamon scones in Evelyn's honor and whispered to the vicar's wife that, "You can tell by the way she cuts her cake. Never trust a woman who doesn't separate the jam from the cream." Miss Marple, for her part, returned home with a fresh ball of yarn and a smile that tugged gently at the corner of her lips. After all, she thought, it is always the smallest key that opens the heaviest door. Chapter 11. The Garden at Midnight. Someone is out in the moonlight, digging up what was meant to stay buried. The moon hung full and unusually bright over St. Mary Mead, casting silver nets across the fields and hedgerows. It was the sort of night that made the village seem like something from a ghost story, still, gleaming, and far too quiet. Chimneys smoked faintly in the cold. The wind had dropped to a hush, and even the foxes were uncharacteristically mute. At Greystone Manor, the shadows were longer than usual, stretched out by the bare branches of the winter roses that clung obstinately to life beside the garden wall. The house, vast and weathered, seemed to shrink back into itself after so many months of grief and scandal. But not everyone was asleep. From the hedgerow that bordered the east side of the property, Miss Marple crouched low, wrapped in a navy wool coat that matched the night, and a pair of sturdy gardening gloves she insisted were for protection against dew. She had been there 20 minutes, just long enough to stiffen in the joints, but not long enough to consider retreating. Her patience was rewarded. There, near the yew arbor, where the paths from the conservatory and chapel wing converged, a figure crept into view. Hooded, purposeful, and carrying something glinting faintly under the moonlight. A spade. Miss Marple adjusted her spectacles. The figure, slender, nervous, knelt beside the old lilac bush and began to dig, pushing aside the frozen crust of earth with surprising determination. Not the main flower beds, but a patch of ground long overgrown and avoided by even the most ambitious gardeners. Miss Marple had always wondered why. The digging continued in silence. Then came a pause, the sound of a sharp intake of breath, and the clink of metal striking wood. The figure hesitated, then cleared more soil and tugged. Miss Marple did not wait for the conclusion. She slipped quietly back through the hedge and onto the main lane. By the time the figure stood fully upright, holding a small iron box caked with dirt, the watcher had gone. She arrived at the vicarage 20 minutes later, rapping softly on the door. The Reverend answered, bleary-eyed but accustomed by now to Miss Marple's curious hours. "I do beg your pardon, Leonard," she said mildly, "but I believe you ought to telephone Inspector Cray. Someone is in the garden at Greystone, digging up the past. Rather literally, I'm afraid." By dawn, the mystery had cracked open. The box, recovered from the scene by Cray and his constables, contained a bundle of papers, ledgers, letters, and a sealed envelope bearing the handwriting of Hugh Lennox, the late solicitor. Inside the envelope was a confession, not his, but one dictated to him and kept in confidence. The writer, Edward Lionel Grieve. The subject, the illegitimate heir, whose existence had been carefully erased by the family. The name, long buried, matched another in the village. Ivy Tansley, Miss Marple said, seated, later in her drawing room with Cray, is not who she has claimed to be. Her mother worked at Greystone for years, and Ivy was passed off as a cousin's child after a hasty relocation to the north. Edward Grieve made arrangements, but the truth always wants sunlight. But why dig it up now? Cray asked. And why murder? Lennox, Clarice, Eyre, they were all connected to this. They were, Miss Marple said, and Ivy knew it. But I do not think she is the killer. She was trying to recover the documents before they could be used against her, or destroyed. You see, Inspector, Ivy never wanted the estate. She only wanted proof of her father's acknowledgement. Her mother died ashamed. Ivy wanted justice, I think. Cray frowned. Then who? Miss Marple reached for her knitting. Evelyn Grieve. She came to the village not to repair the family's honor, but to protect what was left of it. She knew about the heir, and she was determined that no paper, no memory, would change the lineage as she understood it. She had motive, means, and access to every corner of the house. Cray looked thoughtful. I'll need more than that. Indeed. But you'll find the blue gardening gloves Evelyn claimed to have misplaced are tucked behind the arbor. They match the ones worn by the figure in the garden, soil on the cuffs, and if you examine the original ledger, the one she insisted was lost, you'll find a single page torn, the very one that referenced the payment to Ivy's mother. She destroyed that, but not the rest. A moment's haste, and she left the box buried, but not forgotten. By midday, Evelyn had confessed, coldly, quietly, and without a flicker of remorse. I did what was necessary, she told Cray. Our family's name is more than a line on a certificate. Letting it pass to a maid's daughter, a girl raised among the common lot, unthinkable. Miss Marple, who had sat silent throughout the interview, merely replied, and yet so often it's the common lot who prove themselves uncommon in virtue. Later that evening, as frost began to creep once more along the hedges and the moon rose behind the manor spires, Miss Marple returned to the garden. The ground had been neatly filled in. The lilac bush stood undisturbed. From behind her, the vicar's wife approached, bundled in a sensible coat. You were right, Jane, she said. Again. Miss Marple smiled. Sometimes, my dear, the best clues are the ones people go to the most trouble to hide. And it's always curious, isn't it, how murderers forget that gardens are like people. They remember everything that's buried. The two women stood for a moment, watching the pale smoke rise from Greystone's chimneys. The secrets, for now, had been unearthed. The dead, at last, could rest, and beneath the frozen soil, the lilacs waited patiently for spring. Chapter 12. The hour no one could account for. With the pieces in place, Miss Marple unveils the moment the clock truly stopped, revealing a murderer in their Sunday best. It was the third Sunday of Advent, and the bells of St. Catherine's rang with a cheerfulness that stood in curious contrast to the mood in the village. St. Mary Mead had begun, cautiously, to recover from its recent tragedies, though the air still seemed charged with whispered conclusions and unfinished thoughts. The scandal, at Greystone Manor, had settled like frost over ivy, not immediately visible, but clinging stubbornly beneath the surface. Miss Marple sat in the third pew, from the front, her gloved hands resting lightly on a copy of the Book of Common Prayer. Her hat, a rather subdued cloche, trimmed in faded ribbon, cast a slight shadow over her face, but her eyes were as alert as ever. As the vicar delivered his sermon on the virtue of truth, she did not hear him. Her thoughts, like a bird flitting among hedgerows, moved from person to person, clue to clue, all converging on one crucial hour, the one no one could quite explain. After the service, tea was served in the vicarage parlour. The regulars had gathered, Mrs. Bartlett and her lace gloves, Major Little with his booming voice and complaints about the hymn selection, young Ivy Tansley, a touch pale but determinedly upright, and Evelyn Grieve, elegant in a navy coat and pearls that were just slightly too fine for mourning. "I do hope," said Mrs. Fernley, stirring her tea with a kind of ladylike ferocity, "that the whole matter will soon be put to rest. It's been most unsettling." Miss Marple, seated by the hearth with a plate of walnut cake, looked up gently. "But has it, I wonder, been truly put to rest, I mean?" There was a brief pause. Evelyn raised a brow. "Surely, Miss Marple," she said, with her usual calm precision, "with Thomas arrested and the papers recovered, everything of importance has come to light." "Oh, I dare say quite a lot has come to light," said Miss Marple pleasantly. "But not everything. There remains a small matter of time." "Time?" echoed the vicar. "Yes, Leonard. You see, so much of this has revolved around clocks. The one in the study that chimed when it should not, the stopped mantel clock in the library, the muddy boot prints time-stamped by frost. All those little signs, so useful to anyone wishing to manipulate the scene of a crime. But it's the missing time that interests me most." Inspector Cray, who had arrived late and was now leaning inconspicuously against the door frame, folded his arms. "Go on, Miss Marple." She smiled. There was 1 hour, one very particular hour, when no one, not a single person, could quite say what Evelyn Grieve was doing. All heads turned. Evelyn's expression did not flicker. "You mean the night Jonathan Eyre died?" she asked, her voice smooth. "I had retired early." "Just after 9, yes," said Miss Marple, "but Alice saw your lights still on at 10:30. And the constable, making his rounds after the first alarm, noted that a window in the east wing was opened shortly after 11. Evelyn gave a delicate shrug. "I opened it for air. It was a warm night." Miss Marple nodded. "Warm, yes. Though odd, don't you think, to open the window and not the curtains, and even odder to be seen near the conservatory door, just after midnight, by Mr. Tarrant, the gardener, who came to check the greenhouse heating." Evelyn started, then stopped. "Mr. Eyre died between 10 and 11, Miss Marple said gently. "You weren't in your room, you weren't seen by anyone, and you had motive. I had no reason to harm him. You had every reason. You knew Eyre had uncovered the truth about your father's past. You knew the diary existed, and you had to get to it before anyone else did. Clarice, Lennox, Winstanley, they all became threats, didn't they? People who knew too much. But Eyre, he was the final one, the scholar, the one who would make the story known." Evelyn rose slowly. "This is absurd." "And yet," Miss Marple continued, her voice never rising, "you slipped from your room, prepared the poison, a familiar method by now, though less dramatic than your other attempts, and ensured that Eyre would not live to present his findings. Then, after disposing of the evidence, you waited. You nearly succeeded, but there was one flaw." She stood then, small and dignified. "The clock on the mantel," she said. "You stopped it, cleverly, to mislead us. But clocks can be deceived, Evelyn. Unfortunately for you, so can people. But time tells the truth, eventually. There was silence in the room, broken only by the crackle of the fire and the faint clink of a teacup on porcelain. Inspector Cray stepped forward. "Miss Grieve," he said, his voice low but firm, "I think we'd best have a word." Evelyn stood unmoving, then slowly removed her gloves and handed them to the vicar's wife with quiet composure. "My mother would be mortified," she said softly, "but I suppose that's what comes of letting ghosts speak." She was led from the room with no further protest. As the front door closed behind them, the room remained hushed. "Well," said Mrs. Bartlett after a long moment, "I must say, I never liked her pearls." Miss Marple smiled faintly and returned to her cake. "It's curious," she said, "how everyone tried to make the clocks lie, but none of them thought to ask what the hour no one could account for actually meant, not just when someone died, but when someone chose to kill." She reached for her knitting bag, where the needles clicked softly. "In the end," she said, "the truth came out, just as it always does, in a well-tended garden, or a ticking clock. All it needed was the right moment to strike."